Hi, welcome to the first lecture for AP Government. This is our first unit. The unit is called Constitutional Underpinnings or Foundations of Democracy. I'll refer to it as both. But what we're looking at here are the sort of groundwork of U.S. government, so the foundations that our founding fathers were looking at. So the first question is what is government? And the very simple answer is government is an institution, meaning it is an entity, it is a group of people that exists in order to create some sort of civil society and some sort of the structure to how our life works, right? And so in order to do that, they're going to provide some services, and they're going to create regulations or rules or what we call laws. Now, in order for a government to function, a government has to have power, right? Like I can make all the rules that I want, but if I have no power, those rules are meaningless and they're not enforced, and unenforced rules are no rules at all. So government can actually get their power from two different sources. The first source is what we call legitimacy, right? And so if something is legitimate, that means that it's real. We recognize it as being real. We believe that it's real. And so legitimacy means that the people abide by the rule of the government because they believe that the government is operating appropriately, right? Or theoretically in the best interest of the people. The second type of power is called coercive power, right? And so coercive power, if you're coerced into something, it means you're sort of forced into it or manipulated into it, right? And so coercive power is what you see in sort of countries with authoritarian governments or totalitarian governments, where you have some sort of like strong-armed leader who is essentially enforcing rule at the end of a rifle, right? Meaning by force, right? So legitimacy, we do it because we believe that the government is doing what's best for us and it's the right thing to do. Coercive power, we do it because if we didn't do it, we would fear for our lives. So why do we have government, right? If we're going to do all of this, if we're going to have this conversation, if we're going to be in this class, we know what government is, but now we need to ask the question, is government necessary, right? Like, do we have to do this? And it starts, or the idea starts with a French philosopher named Rousseau who came up with this concept of the social contract theory, right? The social contract theory is the idea that we give up what I will refer to as trivial liberty, right? Now, liberty is another word for freedom. Right? So anytime I use the word liberty, you need to hear the word freedom. Okay? But we give up trivial liberty. Now, trivial liberty means freedoms that don't really matter. They're inconsequential, right? For instance, in a system where we have absolute liberty, right? Like absolute freedom, and I can do whatever I want. I could go and just take things from your home, right? I could just rob you because I have the freedom to do that. And the social contract theory is the idea that we give up sort of trivial freedoms, and robbing somebody isn't really a trivial freedom. What we really mean when we say trivial freedoms is things like, using a men's restroom as opposed to the women's restroom, right? Like that's trivial. It doesn't really matter. But we do that for some semblance of order and structure. And so we give that trivial freedom up, right? I don't go and use the ladies' room, even if there's a long line in the men's room, because that's just not how our society is structured. And so with the social contract theory, we give up that trivial liberty, and in return, we get a structure to society, an order to society, to where we have some assurances of some safety or at least limited risk, right? So a good example of trivial liberty would be me driving my car wherever I want, right? I don't drive down the middle of the road. I don't drive on the left-hand side of the road. I drive on the right-hand side of the road because I've given up that trivial liberty of driving anywhere in order to ensure that I have some reassurances from the government that other people are also doing the same thing, and I will be relatively safe driving my car down the right-hand side of the road. The idea here with Rousseau, then, is that without government, civilized life isn't possible, right? The government is actually the entity that provides the structure necessary to have civilization. Okay, now, we can debate as to whether or not that's necessary, but the theory says that without government, society would sort of break down and be incapable of being civilized anymore. So what is the purpose of government? Okay? Governments exist in order to solve conflict, right? So again, if I'm driving my car down the right-hand side of the road and somebody else hits me, I now have a conflict with them, right? Like, they've damaged my property. Government, no matter who you ask on what side of the political spectrum, government exists in order to protect my property, right? So now my property has been damaged because somebody else hit me. I have a conflict. The government is going to exist in order to try to resolve that conflict. So they resolve it first and foremost by making and enforcing laws, right? Like, the other driver blew through a stop sign. He did not follow the law. They made it to make it safe. He didn't follow it. In order to try to enforce that, he's going to get a ticket, right? He's going to have to pay some sort of penalty. And with that, the government will require sort of taxes. It does require people to serve in the military. It does require some people to carry out these missions. So that the people serving in the military, for instance, they're going to help resolve conflicts with foreign nations. The taxes are a means of affording these various programs. And we do have courts that help people resolve disagreements as well. So again, if you and your neighbor, if there's a tree that sort of exists on the property line between you and your neighbor, and that tree is, been dropping a bunch of fruit onto your property, and that's problematic for you, right? You can go before a judge and try to get that resolved in a peaceful manner, right? Resolving that conflict between those two neighbors. Government places limits on what we do. Again, that's part of that social contract theory. Don't drive my car wherever I want, right? That's an acceptable sort of limit on my personal freedom. Government, another one of government's purposes is to provide what we call sort of essential services, right? So those services that we as individuals would not be able to provide for ourselves. Now, the scope of this, or the depth, or the breadth, or the amount of services that the government provides is open to debate. It's wildly debatable, and there's all sorts of different beliefs you can have on the spectrum as to what is or is not important in that regard. But things like, ensuring that the meat that we eat is actually what we believe it is, meaning that it's beef or it's chicken, that it's not been contaminated. Like, these are things that we can't do for ourselves. I can't go to a supermarket and where it says, like, hey, here's some ground beef. There's no way for me to know that that's ground beef unless a government agency has inspected that food, right? I personally cannot defend my home against an invading Canadian army, right? So military, right? That's one of the essential services, or national defense. That's one of the essential services of a government. Okay. So again, major task is that first bullet point here is what I was just talking about, right? The government is going to provide security against foreign entities, terrorism, things that I would be incapable of doing myself, right? Like, I might be able to protect my own home from a single intruder, but if an army were to invade my property, there's nothing I'm going to be able to do about that. Government is also responsible for handling regulations or interactions with other governments, right? Again, I couldn't handle foreign affairs with the Canadian government all by myself, and the Canadian government certainly wouldn't have the patience to try to interact with and reach agreements with 330 million different Americans. No government will ever provide its citizens with everything that they want or need. It's an impossibility. And so there's always a balancing act that has to happen within government, right? So what services do we deem to be more important and what services do we deem to be less important? And this is an economic concept called scarcity. And so at some point in time when you go to economics, you'll learn about that. But the idea of scarcity is that there's simply limited resources, right? The government can only take in so much in taxes. The government only has so many people in its employ that can deal with so many different issues, right? For every hour sort of spent inspecting meat, that's one less hour that the government can pay somebody to inspect, oil wells or drilling sites in the Gulf of Mexico or whatever. And so no nation, regardless of how wealthy the nation is ever going to be able to provide everything. And so as a result, governments generally use power to try to minimize issues and try to preserve whatever it is that they can in order to continue accumulating wealth, right? So a lot of their regulations are going to be sort of economic in nature because the government has an incentive to continue to make money. There are varying types of governments, and in fact, there's a whole bunch, and there's subsets to all of these, but there's sort of three broad ones that we need to cover here, right? And so the first is democracy. Democracy is government by the people, right? So the citizens are the ones that are in charge, and democracy can look a couple of different ways, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in democracy, it's the idea that every man or every woman or every citizen has some voice. Oligarchy is the limitation of power to a select few. Okay, so oligarchy is actually rule by many or rule of many. So now a small group of the people are going to wield all of the power. The majority of the citizens have no power, or they have no control over governmental action or behavior. And then the final one is what we call tyranny. And tyranny is authoritarian governments or totalitarian governments. But tyranny is a system of government in which one person wields all political power, right? And we refer to that person as a tyrant. Okay? Theoretically, you could have something called benevolent tyranny, right? Benevolence simply means like good, and tyranny is where one guy rules everything. And so you have one really awesome dude or lady who makes awesome decisions for all the people and takes care of the people, and they're great. It generally doesn't work out that way, right? There's the old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So most of the time when we look at tyrants, right, they're very negative rulers, right? They're not good to their people. So democracy in the United States. Democracy is actually, it comes from a Greek word that means rule by the people. Okay? And so within the United States, there's actually two different types of democracy. Okay? And we'll actually see both types at times. Okay? But to say that we're a real democracy is a bit misrepresenting of what we actually are as a nation. Okay? So direct democracy, or what I would refer to as true democracy, is rule by the people. That means that every citizen has a voice, every citizen has a vote, every citizen is responsible for making every decision, right? That's not really feasible. Now, do we have instances in the United States in which direct democracy exists and people actually vote on things? Yes, right? Those are called initiatives or referendums. Those are things on the ballot where the people can actually vote on individual laws or individual rules. So it does happen. It just doesn't happen frequently. Now, indirect democracy is what we typically have in the United States frequently. And indirect democracy is sometimes referred to as representative democracy or a republic. And in a republic, what you do is you elect people, and those people then go and represent the citizens, and they're the ones casting the votes and making the decisions and actually running sort of government, and they're the ones that wield the political power. Now, in a representative democracy, the people, every citizen still has power because every citizen is capable of voting for their individual representatives. So when the representative is no longer behaving in a manner in which the citizens want, the citizens can vote that guy out, vote somebody else in. They still wield the power in that regard. They're just not sort of handcuffed by having to make every decision and having to be present for every vote and having to educate themselves on a level necessary to understand every little subset of governmental law and every reaction and every behavior and every little minute detail of how government functions. Our founders didn't want direct democracy. They never wanted direct democracy. They actually didn't like direct democracy. And so to claim that the United States is democracy is misrepresenting what the U.S. truly is. We don't want democracy in the United States for a couple of reasons, right? One, direct democracy is not practical, right? It's certainly not practical today. There's 330 million Americans. I mean, even if you assume you take out the people that are under the age of 18 and are not voting age, you're still looking at well over 200 million Americans. To try to cast 200 million votes on every individual, initiative, law, referendum, like it's impractical. One, it's impractical because you can't get everybody to vote that frequently, but two, it's impractical because there's no way that we as citizens can be well informed enough to cast intellectual votes on every single issue. Second, the founders were elitists. Don't kid yourself about that. They didn't necessarily trust the average citizen. They felt that the average citizen would be too passionate, and that those passions might sway their good judgment, right? But they also felt that they might be too passionate because they would be poorly informed, right? So again, when you go back, and this is another part of the impracticalities, really, when you go back and you look at 1787, the difference between somebody in Boston, Massachusetts, and somebody in Savannah, Georgia was pretty drastic, right? They had different lives, different lifestyles, different means of providing for themselves, and they had very limited interaction. It would have taken weeks to get a single letter from Boston to Savannah, and so therefore they're not well educated in the sense that they're not well informed, right? There's no CNN, there's no Fox News, there's no internet that provides them with constant updates as to what's happening in the world, right? Instead, things travel much, much slower, and so they're far less informed than what we have the opportunity to be today. And so the founders would have been fearful that their passions, their excitement could have superseded their sort of logic or their understanding because they might not have been well informed on an issue. So in order to limit direct democracy, or in order to solve this problem, our founders come up with the idea of a republic, right? So a republic is the same thing as indirect democracy, right? We talked about that. This is where we are electing people for us. It basically solves the problems that we see with direct democracy, right? The impracticalities, the lack of knowledge or lack of awareness, lack of education about certain issues, while at the same time securing us the advantages of democracy so that we have a voice, so that we have control of our government, right? It is still we, the people, meaning we're the ones that provide legitimacy for the government. And when the government begins to operate in a manner that we don't think is legitimate, we can vote those representatives out of office. Our republic, our system of government still operates, still functions, and we continue on even though the government has behaved in a manner that we didn't approve of. Okay, so once we have established the republic, once we have a system of government and that power belongs to the people, just like any sort of power structures or power systems, power is not going to be evenly distributed. So when we look at how power is distributed, there's essentially a handful of different models in terms of who's wielding power. The first one we'll talk about here is what we call majoritarian politics or majoritarian view. Basically, it just says that those people in the majority, those people, or more specifically, those people that lead the majority, are the ones that wield sort of the power in our political system, right? And then there's a breakdown in terms of sort of who those leaders within the majority are. So the first idea comes from Karl Marx, right? So this is Marxist theory. Marx was a big believer that economics is what dictated everything, right? So as far as Marx is concerned, economic influence is the key contributing factor, and therefore those people that are economic elites, the wealthy, are ultimately the ones who are wielding majoritarian power, and they're sort of manipulating or helping to formulate majority opinion in order to do things as the majority, even though obviously they're the sort of wealthy, they're the economic elite. The second idea here is sort of couples the Marxist idea of economics with the third idea, which we'll get to in a second. But C. Wright Mills basically says that there's a power elite which wields the power. So it's a little redundant in that regard. But essentially what he's saying is it's a mix between corporate elite or the economic elite, right? He identifies it as corporate, but Marx would call it the economic elite, and then sort of the bureaucracy, right? And those are the people that work for the government that wield sort of an abundance of power because they're the ones that are in charge of sort of enforcing regulations and writing regulations and things of that nature, right? So Mills there is really a combination then between the two, the Marxist idea and then Max Weber's idea, which is the influence of bureaucracy, right? So he's that idea that those people within the government, those people that are running the government or sort of doing the day-to-day operations of the government, not necessarily the elected officials. Bureaucrats are not elected officials, but rather those people like the director of the CIA who are sort of running intelligence. They're the ones that wield power in this manner, according to Weber. All right. So now, in addition to or in opposition to the majoritarian view, there's the pluralist view. Okay, and so the idea here in the pluralist view is that we don't have a single entity or a single group that wields too much political power. So whether that's the elite, the economic elites, or the corporate elites, or the bureaucracy, or whoever it is, the idea of pluralism is that you basically have a whole bunch of groups, and those groups are competing with one another. They all wield a little bit of power, but not enough power to be able to sort of dictate the system themselves, right? They don't monopolize that power. Okay? So they're going to have to work with one another. They're going to have to share resources. So in this regard, what you do is you spread this power out amongst a large group, which is why we call it pluralism, plural, multiple. None of them wield enough power to sort of dictate anything on their own, and they're constantly compromising with one another. Okay, so what you find in this idea, and this is sort of the ideal model, is that you have this group over here and this group over here, and they might disagree about a whole bunch of things, but they can find some common ground somewhere, and so they'll work together, right? And so therefore there's constant compromises of, you know, I really need to get this done, you really need to get that done, I'll help you if you help me, sort of concept. But because these groups are so abundant and they don't wield enough power to begin with, they're constantly sort of shifting in terms of which group works with which group at what time. Okay, so that brings us to sort of a third idea here, or a third view, and this is what we call hyperpluralism. And this is basically pluralism on steroids, or pluralism gone bad, right? Now we still have a bunch of groups, but these groups no longer feel that they need to compromise or work with one another, and that's why it's gone sour. Okay. Now what they do is they feel, and they may not be, but they feel that they're so strong that they can basically create gridlock, which means grind everything to a halt and prevent government from doing anything. And what we see in hyperpluralism is that there are groups that actually fight change, that try to fight to maintain the status quo, are the ones that are more successful, because it's easy within the hyperpluralism view to grind everything to a halt and stop getting anything done. So therefore, the people that are advocating for that want to maintain the status quo, those are ultimately the ones in the hyperpluralist sense that are successful. The fundamental democratic values that we have, right, there's going to be a handful of these. Number one, we believe in popular sovereignty. Okay, so that's like a vocabulary term. Popular sovereignty is basically the idea of the people ruling things, right? So the sovereignty belongs to the people, right? That's the popular aspect of it. Sovereignty simply means rule. Okay? We believe in the respect for the individual. In fact, when we get into a different unit and we talk about ideals and political beliefs and things of that nature, we'll talk about this in more detail. But for the most part, in the American system, the American structure, we believe in individualism, right? We believe that it's the role of the government to serve the people, not the role of the people to serve the government. That's what we're supposed to believe. We'll talk about that more in a later unit. We believe in liberty. Right? Liberty, I said earlier, is a synonym for freedom, right? So ultimately, the one of the core values of our democratic society is the freedom of individuals to do as they wish, right? And then we believe in equality. And before you're like, no, we don't really believe in equality, I need you to understand that we don't. We don't believe in equality. And in fact, equality is the exact opposite of what we believe in. We don't believe in equality in the sense of everybody is the same or everybody is equal. In fact, if you were to look or to understand human nature, if you've taken AP psychology or dual psychology, you would understand that it's actually part of innate human nature for us to be competitive with one another, for us to want to be better than somebody else. We don't want to simply be the same as everyone else, right? We want that sort of better life. But when we talk about equality in a political sense, we do believe in equality in some regards, right? So what we're talking about is equality of opportunity, for one. Okay? What that means is that in our system, can every child that's born in America, could they go to college? And the answer is yes. Right? It's not equitable in the sense of cost. It's not equitable in the sense of opportunity even, right? Like some people might have a better chance of getting into certain universities than other people, right? If you go to a elite Ivy League schools, you stand a significantly better chance of getting in if mommy or daddy went there, right? So while we don't necessarily have the exact same opportunity, or we don't have the same equality when it comes to the individual institution or how much debt we would have to accumulate in order to obtain that degree, we do have equality of opportunity in the sense that if every single American kid wanted to go to college, that opportunity exists. Some might have to work harder for it than others, but the opportunity is there. Okay, some fundamental aspects of our government or our political process as it pertains to sort of behaviors or how the process plays out. First and foremost, if you're going to have democracy, you have to have free and fair elections. Okay, so that is utterly essential. And so in order to have free and fair elections, you have to, absolutely have to have more than one party, right? Because you have to have some sort of choice. And you need to ensure that every vote is counted equally. Now, this is a good way of helping you understand sort of how generally complex these concepts are, because we don't have fair elections in some senses, right? The election for president of the United States, for instance, is not fair. If it were fair, Hillary Clinton would be our president today. She received more votes than Donald Trump did. But we have something called the Electoral College, which takes other things into account. We still consider that fair because the president doesn't just represent individuals. The president represents a little bit more than that. The other concept is whether or not we have free elections, right? And that's something that's debatable in this day and age. In a number of states now, you have to have an ID to vote, a driver's license, or a state-issued identification card. Those cost money. And therefore, if those are a requirement in order to be able to vote, one could make the argument that that election is no longer free because you have to pay for the resource to be able to cast the vote. Okay, the second thing is within a democracy, we do believe in majority rule. However, there's a key caveat to that, and that is that we believe in minority rights. And so what that means is that if the majority of the people were to decide, and let's just say, let's take race, for instance, right? We have a majority of white people in the United States. If all of the white people got together and decided that only white people could vote, okay, that would be majority rule. And in a general democracy, that would be an acceptable practice. Except we don't believe in just majority rule. We believe in majority rule with minority rights. And that with minority rights dictates that there are going to be times where we can override majoritarian ideologies, majoritarian principles, because we do not want tyranny of the majority, okay, in which 51% of the people dictate or limit the rights or the freedoms of a minority of the people, right? Third up here, we believe in freedom of expression, okay? So you're allowed to say whatever you want. You believe it or not, the Supreme Court has upheld the fact that you can flip a police officer off and they can't do anything about it. Okay? Freedom of expression is essential in a democracy because you have to have free speech in order to be able to discuss ideas and have disagreements and argue about the best way that government is supposed to function. Right? And then the fourth one up here is the right to assemble and protest. Right? These are fundamental rights. Okay, now, we'll talk about these in way more depth when we get into civil rights and civil liberties, but they are essential to our democratic process. All right, some more on the terms of on structures. One, federalism. We're going to go into this in a lot more detail in a later slide or later PowerPoint. But federalism is something that we believe in this country. It's a separation of power between the national government and then state and local governments. We believe in separation of powers. Okay? So with the idea of separation of powers, this is constitutionally created. Congress has certain responsibilities. The president has certain responsibilities. The court has certain responsibilities. We believe in checks and balances. Okay? So this is the idea that no one branch of our government is able to sort of monopolize power and create tyranny, either legislative tyranny, executive tyranny, or judicial tyranny. Each branch is capable of influencing or impacting the behaviors or the outcomes of the other branches. And then finally, we believe in constitutionalism, right? So we have the Constitution. It is a written document, supreme law of the land. What the Constitution says is what should go, right? That is a fundamental aspect of our democratic process.